The terror attacks of September 11th, 2001 rocked the world in many ways. But for Muslim people in the United States and everywhere really, the ripple effects were many and substantial. Filmmaker Deeyah Khan explores that in her new Peabody Award-winning documentary, Muslim in America: Legacy of Fear. It has its North American broadcast premiere tomorrow on TVO, and we're pleased that it brings Deeyah Khan back to our airwaves tonight from Washington, D.C. Welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me. What a pleasure.
It's very nice to have you back on the show and to meet you. Terrific documentary. Before we start our conversation, I just wanted to show a short clip for the audience. Sheldon, could you please roll?
These are people who only believe in jihad. They don't want our system. They don't want our system. These are people that are here, by the way. People here. They want to change your religion. I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think so. Not going to happen. It's going to get worse and worse. You're going to have more World Trade Centers. It's going to get worse and worse, folks. Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on.
That was a clip from your documentary, and I didn't realize that took place in 2015, before Trump was actually elected as president. What was the effect of that kind of rhetoric from President Trump?
I think what that rhetoric did was normalize discrimination against Muslims. I think it normalized the fears that people have. And some of the fears are legitimate, in the sense that if the only sort of story that some Americans know about Muslims is, terrorist attacks by groups like ISIS, then I can understand that fear. But what he did is he instrumentalized that fear and pushed it and manipulated it for the sake of his own votes, basically. So I think what he did is that he brought out into the public space the normalization of dehumanizing Muslims and othering Muslims, and making it acceptable for people to treat Muslims as if they are an invading force, as if they are an enemy within.
There is no Muslim race, there is culture. What can explain this intolerance towards Muslims?
Well, I think, ever since 9/11, I think before 9/11, there was very little. I think Muslims didn't particularly exist in the psyche of Americans. So I think that really brought the word Muslim and Islam to the forefront. And I think, unfortunately, what has happened is, because of the focus on Muslims and the focus on terrorism sort of going hand in hand, and that being the only thing that people get to hear about Muslims, I think has made it possible for politicians like Trump and also various hate groups to utilize that for their own gain. And I think Muslims have been dehumanized to such an extent where it's okay for a president to say something like that, and for his audience to be jubilant and be really excited about him saying that we're not going to allow any more Muslims into this country. He made that okay. If he said that about any other group, it would not be acceptable. But somehow Muslims have been degraded and their humanity has been put so low that passes as okay now.
Are the experiences of Muslims in other Western nations similar, or is this a specific American experience?
I think it's very similar across Western countries. I think what Trump did and was sort of at the forefront of doing is he, being in such a high position, being in the highest position in the country, articulating those views. You've had anti-Muslim and sort of far-right populist politicians all across Europe utilizing people's fears of Muslims for the gain of their own voting blocks, basically. But to have somebody in this high of position to articulate it and to weaponize it, as I say, to this extent, is unique to the US. But he's still playing on a feeling and a tendency that exists everywhere. I mean, just look at the French politicians. And even right now, if you look at what's happening in Afghanistan, the reluctance of a lot of countries, including the EU, releasing a statement, we will protect Europe against a flood of Afghans. What are Afghans? We don't want any more of these Muslims in our country. Nobody wants any more Muslims in their countries, really. So this is something that's we can't just sign off as something that belongs to Trump. This is a tendency that is there across too many countries now. Every country has their own mini Trump now that plays the same game.
It's interesting you say that, because for politicians to say things and not to have pushback from the public is telling. You mentioned the rhetoric being weaponized, and in the past you've said that politics have real life implications. What did you mean by that?
Well, when Trump speaks like that, and the equivalent Trumps across Europe speak like that, that translates into real life, into the streets of whatever country that they're speaking in, to impacting the lives of Muslims. Hate crimes against Muslims have gone up pretty much in every country, and especially in the US. Since his election campaign, it shot up, and it was part of the reason I wanted to make the film, because that story wasn't really being told. Whenever people who claim to be Muslim are the perpetrators of violence, the way that story is told in our public space is very, very different than when Muslims become the victim of violence. The fact that hate crimes against Muslims have gone up significantly, and nobody really reported on it. Nobody really spoke about it. What does it mean? I kept thinking, what would it feel like to be a young child, to be an 8-year-old, a 9-year-old, sitting at home watching your president saying essentially that people like you are not welcome in this country? How does that make somebody feel? Where does that put you in the context of your own country, and how much you actually belong or are accepted or respected or included in that society? It says a lot. So it does a lot to people emotionally, but also, as I say, violence against Muslims, physical attacks against Muslims also went up with very little attention, with very little coverage.
And in the documentary, you speak to a couple of Muslims who have experienced violence, who are the survivors of that rhetoric. I wanted to show a clip from the documentary. Sheldon, if you could please roll.
What's really curious about it still, what's really interesting about it is that I've served not only as a Peace Corps volunteer, but I also served as a military interpreter with the Marines for 3 years, on the front lines against Islamic terrorism. The individuals that helped and harbored al-Qaeda who attacked the United States, a country that I love very much. And what's interesting is I never thought that I'd deal with a sense of unwantedness after coming home from Afghanistan. It feels like you're not seen. It feels like you're never going to be good enough.
That was Baktash, who you featured in the documentary. He also said something that has just really stuck with me. He said that the only home that he's ever known is his parents. And when you consider that he served, he was in the Marines. When we talk about patriots, some of the people in the militias consider themselves to be patriots. I think anyone would consider Baktash to be a patriot, yet he faces this kind of otherness. What is his story?
I actually have goosebumps, and I mean, I edited the film, I shot it, but he always, the way he speaks and what he says always really, really touches me, because his feelings and what he is going through and his experiences will never factor in on any kind of statistics or any kind of hate crime figures or anything like that. He came to America when he was a child, fleeing Afghanistan, and was so grateful to come to America. His family was so grateful to come to America. And every single thing that he could throughout his childhood and his teen years was to try desperately to fit in, to try desperately to be accepted and to be acknowledged as one of the group, as an American. And he always felt rejected. He never felt like he was good enough. And I mean, this is my interpretation, but I feel the part of the reason he joined the military and went with America actually back to Afghanistan, helping America. I think part of that must have also been his gesture of wanting to do the ultimate, wanting to sacrifice the ultimate and give his ultimate commitment to America. And even after he does that, that's sort of the heartbreak of his story, is even after he does that, it's still not good enough. He's still one of those people that are the enemy, the people that can never be trusted, the people that are not like us, the people that we should be afraid of and suspicious of, and people who we don't really, truly, actually want here. So what that must have done to him is heartbreaking, and this feeling that he carries with him resonates with so many of us. I mean, I come from a Muslim family as well. I've had, when I was growing up, I felt the same, and it breaks you in a way that is very difficult to sort of put back together again. And I like, for example, even now, people think that this is just very extreme cases, or that this sort of anti-Muslim sentiment isn't that prevalent. Even today, if I was to tweet something or go on social media and say something positive about Muslims, or say that Muslims are victimized in this, that, or other way, I will be inundated with anti-Muslim tweets. Well, why don't you talk about your jihadis? You people do this. You people cut your women. You people, I mean, it's just endless. So we're not allowed to be human. Muslims are not allowed to be human. Muslims are not allowed to hurt. Muslims are not allowed to be traumatized. Muslims are not allowed to have their own story that is complicated, that is full of their humanity. They're only allowed to be terrorists or the victims of their own communities in some way, as women. And that's an exhausting story and an exhausting context to have to constantly carry with you. And so Baktash's story, I think, is the story actually of a lot of young Muslims who feel dislocated and disconnected from their own country. They want to be a part of their land. They want to be a part of their country, but their country doesn't want them in the same way and doesn't embrace them in the same way.
And I think, too, there's a bit of a dismissal that can happen when you don't see the obvious wounds, like on the body,
Yes.
that it's kind of like you're being a snowflake, you need to be tougher, toughen up. But in the documentary, you speak to Muslims who have been injured. Their lives were almost ended because of this hatred. And I don't know if it says something about me that I was surprised that a couple of them actually forgave their attackers. What did you make of their ability to forgive these heinous acts?
I thought it was extraordinary. One of the stories is of this man who was shot in the face 10 days after 9/11. By a white supremacist who was seeking revenge on Muslims and was looking for Arabs, is what he was saying. And this Reis Bouyan, he survived the attack, and after sort of putting his life back together, he dedicated his life, because Mark Stroman, his attacker, was arrested and then subsequently put on death row because he'd killed 2 other people in this shooting spree. And Reis Bouyan, this Muslim immigrant from Bangladesh, spent years of his life trying to get this man off of death row and forgave him. And similarly, another young woman, Asma Jama, who forgave her attacker as well. I think the fact that you're surprised by it as well, I think, is really telling, because again, this comes back to the stories that we tell about each other. If we don't know Muslims, if we don't know Muslims to just be human beings, to be amazing, to be creative, to have the capacity to forgive and have mercy and to have compassion, and also do horrible things. If Muslims are not allowed to have the range of emotions and behaviors of what it means to be a human being, then we're sort of flattening and dehumanizing them. And I think the fact that we have a hard time wrapping our head around Muslims having the capacity to forgive and to engage in this sort of way says something about how little we know about the Muslim experience and the way so many people express their faith. So we are allowing terrorists and extremists on the Muslim side to define what it means to be a Muslim. We're all doing that.
I think for me, what was surprising, I kept thinking that the people who committed these acts, the way that you said, how you describe it, it's a flattened image, that if the roles were reversed, I wonder if that humanity could have been shown to, if they would be able to show that humanity to that individual. Reis, for example, mentions that he can still feel the pellets in his face, and to be able to forgive someone and to advocate for them is just extraordinary.
Extraordinary.
Yeah.
It's so touching.
Yeah.
It's so touching. And it's, you know, if, and this is again one of the reasons why it was so important to try and tell these stories and to try and make this film, because these stories are not in our public space. And also, anytime violence happens, if when the perpetrator is Muslim, the kind of coverage and attention that that attack gets, it's wall-to-wall coverage in every Western country. But when an attack against Race Guyan happens because he's a Muslim, we don't see the same level of coverage. And I found so many stories that I wasn't even able to include in this film. And I remember thinking at the time, this is incredible. Why have I never heard of this? You know, and then I look through the press coverage that it's gotten, and it's minuscule in comparison. So we have to ask ourselves, why is that? Why is it when a Muslim is a victim, it doesn't get the same coverage as if when a Muslim is the actual perpetrator? What does that, just that in itself says something. Is the life and humanity of a Muslim less valued and less important to us than the lives and violence committed against white people? You know?
You also featured the family of a man sentenced to 30 years in prison for a plot to bomb an apartment building where many Muslims lived. And these were largely Somali refugees. What did his family tell you that led Patrick Stein down the path that he took?
It was an extraordinarily wonderful family, absolutely broken by what has happened to them and the fact that they've now lost their son to this very long prison sentence. What they told me is the changes that they noticed in him and the process of radicalization that he went through, and the fact that the part of his radicalization was Trump's rhetoric, I thought was really important. And again, something that's not examined enough, what this type of political rhetoric does to people. So he had gone from sort of starting on the same baseline fear that a lot of people have of Muslims and not knowing very much about them, to then starting to hear his president legitimizing his fears, and not only legitimizing those fears, but giving a solution, that the solution is these people should not be here. So let's stop any more of them from coming in, and let's figure out the ones that are here. So sort of positioning Muslims as an enemy within that need to be dealt with. And then on top of that, then he started delving farther and farther into far-right media, and basically immersed himself, or became trapped in this echo chamber where everything that he would hear about Muslims would just be the same loop, and also the sort of volume of it becoming more and more intensified, the dehumanization of Muslims getting more and more dialed up, where he got to the point where he realized or felt that actually violence against them is perfectly acceptable. And he used words, and you hear it a little bit in the film, and there's more in some of the transcripts, talking about Muslims as cockroaches, talking about them as vermin, and talking about himself as an exterminator, that he was going to clean this up. When have we heard that type of language before? Anytime there is genocide, anytime there is extreme violence against people, you hear people dehumanized down to cockroaches and insects that need to be exterminated, that there's an infestation of them in our country and we need to handle it. And this is very, very dangerous. And I wouldn't say that Trump was the only radicalizing factor in his sort of path of becoming as extreme as he did, but he was a significant part of his radicalization. That is something worthy of note. And that is not just something worthy of note from America, but that's also worthy of note of all of our other mini Trumps that we have now across everywhere. And you know this in Canada, as well as anybody, what this type of radicalization makes people capable of. We're seeing attacks against Muslims. We've seen it in Canada, we've seen it in Norway. Breivik, took the lives of 70 plus young white kids because he feels that their parents and people like them are inviting in Muslims and we don't want Muslims here. What happened in New Zealand? And these attacks are going to continue, I'm afraid to say.
It was really interesting. It's for watching it. You spoke to some militia members who are targeting the Muslim community, and one of them said that everybody wants to belong, nobody wants to be an outcast, which struck me as interesting because, for race and even baktash, they also wanted to belong, and I think that's something that these groups are using to say that they're looking for belonging, yet the people they're targeting are also looking for belonging.
Yes, I mean, this is what really strikes me as incredibly important. I've done films about jihadis. I've done films about white supremacists. I've done film, about abortion terrorists. One of the uniting factors, one of the most basic human needs that we all have, is the need to want to belong. And it's such a profound need that we all have, to be seen, to be heard, to be valued, to be understood, and to be a part of a greater whole. And just like you're saying, Baktash has that need, these militia guys, even the jihad, all of us, we have this. Where our politics is failing us is our politics is a politics of fear rather than a politics of solidarity. We need our politicians to be able to articulate that these are the same needs that we all have. We have all the same challenges, and the solutions also have to be solutions that include all of us, rather than taking these needs and driving wedges of division even deeper, separating us even more from each other. It's that group's fault that you're not doing well. It's that group's fault that that inequality is rising, and that's obviously not the case. So I do put a lot of the responsibility on our politics and our politicians, and how they are not stepping into creating a politics that includes everybody, but also our media, quite honestly. And it's part of the reason I actually started making films, was to try and tell stories that can help us understand each other better. Whenever I filmed, even with the militia guys, I'm very, very clear about the fact that even though they might believe things that I don't believe, even though their positions and even their actions are very, very problematic and also violent and dangerous, I refuse to dehumanize them. Even if they dehumanize people, I will not do it to them, because we have to break that cycle. And I still wanted to make sure that their side of the story was told with the same tenderness and the same respect and the same humanity. So I can also not flatten, just as much as I'm sitting here saying you can't flatten Muslims' humanity, you also can't do that to these people. As easy as it is, and as satisfying as it probably would feel, we can't do it. We have to stop breaking this silence of us and them, and the divisions and the hatreds and the fears. The only way to bridge it is we have to talk to each other. We have to understand each other, and we have to try and build bridges of understanding between people. And with some are too far gone, we can't do that. But with very many, it is doable, but we have to invest the effort. And I wish our politicians would, but they're not. So then it's down to us, to communities, to Baktash, to me, to some of these militia, for all of us to go, we're going to have to figure this out, because we have to find a way to live together.
Deeyah, this is a terrific documentary. Congratulations on the Peabody. We're looking forward to watching Muslim in America, Legacy of Fear. It's going to be premiering this Saturday, September 11th at 9 p.m. Deeyah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.